everyone. So again, welcome to our last class. Today we're going to be talking about convolutional neural networks. And I know that sounds like a really fancy name, but don't worry, we're here to break everything down for you so it becomes easy to understand. You're probably seen the word CNN thrown around multiple times. If you've ever looked into AI, if you've ever seen some research project, if you've seen generally CNNs are very widely used and they're very versatile. And we use CNNs for mainly image classification, but we'll get into that in just a bit. So for today's class, we're going to start off with obviously some CNN theory, which is basically everything behind the CNN, what makes it work, what it is. And then after that, we're going to go and design our own CNN, and then we'll have some announcements, and then we're going to say goodbye to each other. Um, Not forever, just for now. Also, quick note, whenever I say CNN, I'm referring to convolutional neural network. So don't get confused. CNN is just the short form. All right, so without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump into CNN theory or convolutional neural network theory. So we're gonna do a really fast, really quick activity. So I'm gonna draw something and you guys are gonna tell me what you guys think I'm drawing. So I'm gonna draw like right down over here. Take your time. You guys can put in the chat what you guys think I'm drawing. Okay, I'm done. Can you guys tell I'm not an artist? Okay, I see some things. House, house. Yes. So I did draw a house. And what you guys just did is something called object recognition. So you were able to see something and you were able to pick out what is on the screen. So that's something your brains are able to do naturally. We want our computers to do the same thing. And what allows our computers to do that is CNNs. So, what exactly are CNNs then? Well, a CNN is a type of neural network that is especially good at recognizing patterns in images, like shapes, colors, or textures. They're built to handle images by focusing on small parts of the image at a time, and this makes them really fast, smart, and more accurate for vision tasks. So, this is a very, very high level definition, a very broad, simple definition of what a CNN is. We're about to deep dive into how it does this and what it does exactly in just a couple minutes. But all you need to garner from this slide is that CNNs are neural networks, or a type of neural networks, that are used for image recognition. So whenever we have image recognition tasks, most commonly people use CNNs. So keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and give a quick recap of neural networks because as you see in this definition, it says a CNN is a type of neural network. So if you want to understand what a CNN is, you have to make sure you understand what a neural network is. Now, we did go over neural networks last class, but if you somehow maybe didn't get time to watch the recording, missed it, or just forgot what a neural network is, because I admit it is a little complex, we're about to go over the basic stuff. So let's take a look at what a neural network looks like. So without looking at the text on the slide and just focusing on our image here, you see that we have like a network of these like circles, and each of these circles that you see here are called neurons. So every circle you see is called a neuron, and they're all interconnected using these lines that represent um, them sending information to one another. We have three different kinds of layers. We have this input layer right here, and the input layer is essentially where we send our image, or in this case, image, but where we send the input to the model. So that's what the input layer does. It just takes in our input. Then we have our hidden layers, which we never see. We never see what's going on inside of them because they are hidden. But these hidden layers are the ones that are finding patterns in the data, and are detecting things that will help the model make a prediction at the end. And speaking of predictions, that brings us to our output layer, which ultimately returns the prediction of the model. So this is just have this image in your brain when we're talking about neural networks. This is what a neural network fundamentally looks like. And from network to network, there are probably changes in like how things are interconnected and things like that. But just know that overall, a neural network looks something along the lines of this. Now, for a quick definition in just one sentence, hold on, we're getting people entering our room. For a quick one sentence definition, a neural network consists of an input layer that receives the starting data, one or more hidden layers of interconnected neurons that extract and transform these features. Basically, a fancy way of saying they're finding patterns in data. And then finally, an output layer that produces the final predictions. Now, if you're looking at the word neuron and are wondering what in the world that is, don't worry, that's what our next slide is for. Again, this is just a recap, so this should not be new information. But if it is, you guys can go back to last week's recording and just watch that. But this is what a neural network essentially looks like. Just know that there's an input layer, there's hidden layers in between, and then we have an output layer. And data is passed through this, and in the end, we get a prediction. All right. So let's go back and remember I talked about how there's neurons that make up that neural network, and you're probably wondering, wait, I forgot what a neuron is. Well, don't worry, we're about to go over that. So what a neuron is essentially this image right here. Now, looking at this, you're probably really confused, like, why are there different functions? Like, what is going on? But to put it really simply, a neuron takes in numerical input, transforms the input, and then decides whether or not it wants to send that input out into the model again. So it's kind of like a filter in itself. So we refer to these neurons in computer science or specifically in machine learning as artificial neurons. And what they do is they take an input. So if you look at this column right here, you see a bunch of X's. Oh, I don't know if my drawing skills are not that great. But you see a bunch of X's, and all of these X's represent an input. Then you see this second column called weights. Now, weights are basically a value that determine how important an input is towards the model. So basically, it's something the inputs are multiplied by to kind of give importance to the features. And the model, when it gets trained, it ultimately learns to adjust these weights. But all you need to know is that the inputs are multiplied by the weights and then passed through this thing called a transfer function. Now, a transfer function, if you forgot, all it does is it adds up the sum of the products of the input and the weights. So after multiplying all the inputs by the weights, it adds up all the products, and that sum is then fed to this thing called an activation function, which if you remember, we went over many kinds of them last meeting. But an activation function basically determines whether or not it wants to send that piece of data, that final sum, forward in the model or not. Because the neuron's job is to decide whether something is important for a prediction or not. And so this activation function basically lets it know if it is. So if it's not important, it won't give priority to that and it won't send it forward in the same way that it might send something that's really important to the model forward. And it knows how important something is by looking at those weights that we talked about earlier. So just if you are confused, just think of a neuron as a mini function, okay? These are all just mini functions in our vast neural network. And maybe to make it a little bit easier for you guys to understand, let's go back one slide. Remember that these dots that you see in this neural network are all individual neurons. So if you're wondering, okay, so a neuron is a function, but where does it go? Well, it's basically the unit that makes up neural networks. So in this image, you see a bunch of neurons and they're all interconnected. They're taking input, they're transforming it, they're getting the sum, they're putting it into an activation function, which is a fancy word for saying they're deciding whether or not it's important. And if it's important, they're going and sending it out to the next neuron for it to further find patterns in the data, for it to further decide if it's important or not. Basically, it's like a big filter. It's like a web filter. Okay. So now that we've discussed what neural networks are, we have two things. We have a CNN and we have neural networks. So you're probably wondering, what is it that makes CNN special? Why are not all neural networks CNNs? Well, the thing that CNNs have that set them apart is something called convolutional layers. So, convolutional layers are layers within a CNN that use filters referred to as kernels to detect patterns in input data. These kernels are slid over images to produce an output called a feature map. And then ultimately, stacking these layers allows the network to learn a lot of complex patterns. Now, I know this was a ton of terms, right? You're probably like, wait, a kernel? Like, is that a popcorn kernel? Like, why is there food? Like, you're probably wondering, what is a feature map? What do you mean sliding over? What do you mean stacking these layers? Well, don't worry. So this slide is just a kind of a preview about what we're about to get into. So all you gotta get from this is that these convolutional layers exist inside convolutional neural networks, and they basically set CNNs apart from normal neural networks or any other kind of neural network. We'll delve into what all these fancy terms like kernels and feature maps mean, and actually now we're about to go through a model step by step, basically, and explore these vocab terms, basically. So let's start off with the idea of a kernel. So no, it's not a popcorn kernel or anything like that. This is a math focused thing. So if you guys are in pre-calc or calculus, you're probably about to learn this concept or have learned this concept. If you're not there yet, don't worry, we're going to explain it super intuitively. So a kernel also referred to something as called a filter. They're kind of interchangeable names. Typically people say kernel. But a kernel is an essential element of a CNN that allows the network to identify important image features like edges, textures, or patterns. So when I showed you guys that house earlier that I drew, you guys were able to immediately tell what that was after looking at the fact that I drew a door, or looking at the fact that I drew like a square and then a triangle on the top. So kernels, their job is to basically recognize those patterns. So what you did with your brain just now, we want to do with our kernels. So what are they exactly, right? Are they like a string? Are there like a text that says look for straight lines look for look for like a triangle? Well, not exactly. So in the end, obviously, everything in CS comes down to math and numbers. So what we have here is that kernels are something called matrices, or a kernel is something called a matrix. Now, don't worry if you've never heard this matrices or matrix term before. It is kind of an advanced concept, but all you need to know for now is that a matrix is a grid of numbers. So it's not one number, but it's kind of like a spreadsheet. You can think of it as a spreadsheet, right? You have your rows and your columns. Matrices are really similar in this way. So matrices is just a grid of numbers, and that is what a kernel is. So the numbers within that grid are referred to as our weights. So you're probably saying, wait a minute. Huh, get it? Wait a minute. You're probably thinking, wait a minute, I saw that word earlier. And that word basically allowed the model to determine whether something was important or not. Well, here weights are doing the same thing. So here we're going to get to it in a bit, but weights are basically determining how important certain parts of the image are. Now, the main thing that you need to get from the fact that there's weights inside of our matrix is that these values are learnable. So these are the values that are getting adjusted. Because remember, if you came back from our linear regression class or any other class, the model adjusts the weights to end up making the right predictions. So in this case, the kernel values or the weights inside the kernels are what are going to be adjusted in order to get our prediction. Now we'll get there in a bit. But if you look at this image right here, this is kind of an example of what a matrix looks like. Typically, we use a 3 by 3 matrix, which means there's 3 rows and 3 columns. But we use different sizes for different tasks. But for now, we're going to stick with the default, which is typically 3 by 3. So what you guys learned in this slide are that kernels are filters that allow the network to identify important parts of an image, and they are a matrix of numbers, or basically a grid of numbers that are the weights of the model. Now, taking into account what they are, let's go into what they do, right? Or what the convolutional neural network does with the kernel. So ignore the little GIF or GIF that's on the bottom right corner for now. Let's go into what it does first. So what happens is that that matrix, that kernel that we saw earlier, is placed on the top left corner of the image that we're working with. So let's say we have an input image, right? What happens first is that that kernel, that little grid that we saw earlier, is placed on the top left corner of the image. So what that means is that it's basically mapped to it. So now let's look at our GIF here. You see this thing called a sharpen filter? Ignore the name, but that is essentially a kernel, okay? And you see that it's like almost looking at different parts of our input. Now, our input, if you look over here, you're probably like, that's not an image. That's just a bunch of numbers put together. Well, how images are made of pixels, right? Or they're basically parts of an image. Those pixels also have numerical values based on their color. So that's what those values represent. I think 255 is black and 0 is or it might be 255 is white and 0 is black, but that's not important for now. All you gotta know is that pixels have numerical values as well, and those numerical values are based on their color or their brightness or things like that. That's something that's automatically done, so you don't need to worry about that. But back to the point, our kernel is like looking at different parts of the image. Now, ignore this part for now. Okay, ignore what's happening over here. Let's look at our input. So look at where it's starting. Let's give it a moment to restart. Notice how it just started at this top left quadrant on of the image. That's doing exactly what this first step states. So a kernel is placed on the top left corner of the image. So in this exact GIF, we see our kernel looking at the top left corner of the image. Now you're probably like, okay, so it's looking at it now. What does it do? So now we get into our math part. So what happens here is that every value inside the kernel, so the -1, the -1, all these numbers inside the kernel are multiplied by their corresponding pixel value. So what that means is that we just saw the kernel looking at a part of the image, right? And every image pixel has its own numerical value. So whatever matching part of the matrix aligns up with the input, those two numbers are about to get multiplied. So for example, this -1 over here would get multiplied with this 21 over here because positionally they're in corresponding locations. And then what happens after that, after all these numbers have been multiplied, the sum of those products are found, and then that sum of the product is stored over here. So this is something called a feature map. Don't worry about that yet. We're about to delve into that. But just know that after multiplying all of the values in our kernel by whatever corresponding values are in our image, the sum of all that is found and put into a separate thing. And we'll get into that thing in a sec. But the thing stores the sum of the products of what was multiplied from within the matrix of our kernel and the image pixels themselves. So after that happens once, you see the kernel almost looking at different parts of the image. What happens there is that the kernel essentially slides over or shifts by one on the image. So look at how it's changing positions on the input. So look at how the kernel is looking at the image and how it's kind of like scanning it. Well, if it stood in one place, it wouldn't be able to process the entire image. So obviously the kernel has to shift a bit and look at different parts of the image at a time. So after calculating the first maybe top left corner, it starts moving a bit to the right. So That's what this third step says. The kernel is slid 1 pixel to the right, which is our default. You can always change how much it slides by, but honestly, there's no reason to mess with that for now. Default is 1. And then the next number is computed. So these numbers over here, they're all done after the kernel has slid. So the reason they're different numbers is because the kernel is sliding and taking into account all of the pixels in the image. Now, this process of calculation, slide, calculation, slide, calculation, slide is repeated until the kernel has covered the entire image. So that's what this step is. After the kernel has covered the whole image, a feature map is produced. Now, if you're confused as to what a feature map is, let's get into that right now. So a feature map is basically an output of the convolution operation. Now, what's a convolutional operation? Well, a convolutional operation is basically the math thing that we just did in the previous slide. That act of multiplying the inside of the kernel by the image pixels is what a convolution operation is called. Now, a feature map is the output of that. So if you look back to our little GIF or animation here, you see that our output is being updated and you see that it's also a matrix. So this output is what our feature map is. So again, it's also represented as a matrix, as you guys can clearly tell from how it looks. But you're probably wondering, right, what is the point of this? Well, the feature map basically highlights where in the image the kernel detected pattern happens. So if you remember, our kernel is basically our detector. It finds the pattern, but our feature map tells us where it found that pattern. So bigger numbers show that that pattern, that whatever pattern that kernel or that filter was looking for, bigger numbers let us know that this is where in the image that pattern occurred the most. So higher numbers means the pattern was more present in that location of the image. So it basically helps the model build a foundation of like general understanding of where things are and when they see an image. That's basically what these feature maps and what these kernels help the model do. So as a quick review, we have these things called kernels. They're filters, and they basically look at every part of an image, perform some math operations, which really aren't that complicated. They're really just multiplying everything and then adding everything together. They perform these math operations and then store that sum, the ultimate value, inside a feature map. And the feature map basically tells us where a certain pattern was detected or where a certain pattern was most detected. Because when we have a higher number, we know that that pattern showed up in that particular location the most. So if you look at this output example, we have the middle grid, the middle number is 258. So whatever pattern that the kernel was looking for occurred most in this pixel right here. The 250, the pixel with the value of 258 at the end of the convolution operation, that is where in the image that pattern occurred the most, or basically where the kernel found it the most. So that is basically the relationship between kernels, our input, and then the feature maps, which are our output. So think of it like this. We have our image, we have our kernel. Our kernel looks and scans all of the image and stores values of where certain patterns happen inside the output, which is called the feature map. If you guys know what a heat map is, then you can kind of associate a heat map with a feature map. All right, let's move on. Let me delete my drawings. All right, so we have these three things. We have our input, our image, our kernel, and then we have our feature map. But how does this all fit into the network, right? These are all abstract terms that are floating around in your brain. So let's put them back inside our network. So convolutional layers, or that special kind of layer that we talked about earlier that CNNs have, that not all neural networks don't, are the ones that produce these feature maps that we just talked about. So inside of the convolutional layers, kernels are going to be sliding over parts of the image and generating these feature maps. So where this happens, you guys are already familiar, right? The hidden layers in a simple neural network are where the pattern recognition happens. So in our case of convolutional neural networks, the convolutional layers, which are the hidden layers for this network, are the ones doing pattern recognition. And the way the pattern recognition is happening is through the use of these kernels and through the generation of these feature maps. After a convolutional layer has executed, or basically been performed, we get feature maps at the end, right? Well, typically in CNNs, we then introduce our pooling layer. Now, what a pooling layer does is it takes the feature maps, basically the output of the convolutional layers, and it kind of compresses them and reduces their size for something called downsampling. So what this does is that it gets rid of those small little variations in data and it preserves only the most important the most important information in our feature maps. So this basically allows us to have more consistent data instead of fluctuating data. It allows the model to do less computation, so it's faster, and basically allows it to be more efficient. Because we don't want data that's not necessarily going to help the prediction to still be influencing the model's predictions, right? So what pooling does is it compresses everything and only preserves the most important pieces of data in the feature map. Okay? So we have our convolutional layer that took the images and outputted feature maps after sliding the kernels or the filters all over them. And then we have our pooling layer, which took that feature map and compressed it and only retained the most important values of it. Then you're probably like, okay, but I see another convolutional layer after pooling layer. I thought we just had one here. Well, typically pooling layers are typically right after convolutional layers. So that's what a pooling layer is, and that's what a convolutional layer is. So in this case, our second convolutional layer will receive a bunch of feature maps stacked together. So you're probably like, oh, why are there multiple feature maps? Well, one layer produces multiple feature maps. That's just something you should understand. So one layer, we have a bunch of neurons, right? These neurons are all working together to create feature maps. Whatever feature map number we specify, the layer, the layer will produce. So you're probably wondering where do those feature maps go? And if there's so many of them, how exactly does the model know which one to pick? Like how does it work? But after everything gets pooled, so only the important stuff remains, these bunch of different feature maps are essentially stacked up to create a depth. So they're stacked together and then they're fed to the next convolutional layer. And basically, in that next convolutional layer, kernels learn patterns of patterns. So now we're feeding the second layer with a bunch of more feature maps. And you're like, but what about the image, right? There's nothing to learn from. The first couple feature maps that are generated are a foundation. And then after that, all the other layers are going to be running those kernels over those feature maps. So they're basically finding patterns of patterns. And the reason this is important is that because it basically develops the models or the neural network's intelligence. So the first convolutional layer, or the first time the kernel goes through the first couple feature maps that are produced, maybe the model will only learn to recognize edges, maybe edges that are present in the image. But then the second convolutional layer, which trains on top of the patterns that they found last layer, maybe we'll start to recognize some shapes. Instead of just little edges or vertices, maybe the model will piece together that there are certain shapes in this image. Then we feed it to our third convolutional layer, and that layer will learn the pattern of the pattern it found in the previous layer. And then ultimately, we can get to the point where our layers are able to detect the actual objects. So that's our final goal, right? Object detection. What did you guys do when you guys told me that my drawing was a house? You did object detection, right? You detected the object as a whole. So our goal is to make CNNs do the same thing, and as we go layer from layer to layer to layer to layer, the CNN basically learns to understand patterns of patterns of patterns of patterns, and ultimately gets really, really smart. So from being able to like detect these small things like vertices, it ultimately is able to detect whole objects. So I think that's really cool. That's basically how CNNs train. But now we have to get into the fact that how does it know, right? How does it know if something's a shape? How does it know where it's an object? Well, the truth of that matter is that they do something called back propagation, which looks like a really fancy word, but it's a really, really simple concept. So remember those weights that we talked about earlier? Okay, yeah. Remember those weights that we talked about earlier that were inside those kernels? And remember how I said that those weights are adjustable so they can change? Well, the model basically checks its predictions. Basically, it creates a prediction, checks it against the actual prediction, calculates a loss function, basically how far off it was, and then based on that goes back and adjusts those little values inside the kernels to make a more accurate prediction. So going over the text on the slide here, this entire process is called back propagation. So a prediction is made, then compared to the actual value. The model then calculates the loss. There's a lot of complicated functions that go ahead and do that. We've gone over some of them in our past lessons if you're interested, but basically calculates how accurate it was. And if it's and then based on that accuracy, it'll go backward through the model, hence why it's called back propagation. It'll go backward and adjust those little kernel weights that we saw inside to make the model focus on maybe different features or different parts of the image that may help the model make a more positive prediction or a more accurate prediction. And then over time, the initially random kernel weights, because in the beginning it doesn't know what to look at, right? So in the beginning it's just a bunch of random numbers. But over time, as it continues to learn, those initial values change so they become real feature detectors. So ultimately, like let's say I made a CNN to detect whether something's a house or not, it'll be able to accurately recognize that, oh, I see a door, I see a window, I see a roof, that's a house. So looking at our GIF over here, let's have it restart. We see our model making a prediction. All our layers are being run. And then we're having a loss function, which calculates how far off it was. And then after calculating how far off it was, it goes backward and adjusts all those little weights to see if that would make a more accurate prediction. And we see that the process just restarts all over again. So basically, this is how the model learns what things are. It's basically through trial and error, honestly. It makes a guess, it checks if it was good or not, and then based on that, it goes back and changes values to make a more accurate guess. And then in the end, after like a lot of iterations of this back propagation algorithm, the model will ultimately be able to accurately do object detection. So this is basically how the weights in the kernels are important. Now I'm going to pass it over to Avid, who is going to explain our project for today, which is super, super cool. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions on anything CNN related? I'll like wait like 20 seconds if anyone has a question. Okay, I think we're good to go. So I mean, passing it over to you.
Okay, so hopefully you guys got a good understanding of what CNN is now. Now we can like finally like implement all these concepts and jump into our really cool research project of breast cancer image classifier using CNNs. So just like a little bit of a background of like research for this cancer detection model before we jump in is if you're wondering like what breast cancer is, breast cancer basically happens when cells in the breast grow uncontrollably. So I'm sure you guys have heard the word tumor before. So these cells, they're basically forming a lump. That's the tumor. That can be seen on scans or it can just be like felt as a lump. And when you think of tumor, you're probably thinking, oh, that's harmful, that's dangerous. But technically, not all tumors are cancerous. Some of them are known as benign, non-cancerous, so they're not harmful. But then again, breast cancer is one of the most common cancers worldwide, especially in women, and millions of people get affected every year. So improving diagnosis tools like implementing like AI, like we're going to be creating this model, it's really important because it can actually like save lives. So comparing benign and malignant tumors. So benign tumors are the non-cancerous ones. They grow slowly and they stay localized, so they're not spreading to other parts of the body. They often have like smooth and regular shapes, and they're usually not life-threatening. They're not harmful. Sometimes they can be removed by surgery, and they like rarely return if they are removed. On the other hand, though, we have malignant tumors, which are the cancerous ones. They go quickly and uncontrollably. They can invade nearby tissue and like spread to other parts of the body. This is known as metastasis, and they often appear in irregular or jagged shapes. They are very harmful and they can be life-threatening if untreated. So if you guys look on the right, we have two images. The first one is the benign one. You can see it's like a nice circular, smooth-looking shape. And then beneath that, we have the malignant tumor, which obviously it's like much more disorganized and it's like jagged. It doesn't have smooth edges. This is the one that's going to be spreading to like other parts of the body, and that's the one that's harmful. So in our project today, and the CNN's job is basically to learn patterns in tumor images that can help us distinguish between these benign or malignant tumors. This is so important for early diagnosis and treatment. You might be wondering, why is early detection important? Early stage cancer is so much easier to treat and has so much of a higher survival rate because later stages are so much harder to treat because the cancer may have spread. Like with the malignant ones, if it spreads to other parts of your body, it can become a lot more harmful and a lot harder to treat, like a lot harder to get rid of. Some methods of detection include mammograms, which are like x-rays of the breast, like the image on the right, that's an example of a mammogram. Some other ways to detect it are ultrasounds or MRIs or biopsies. Biopsies are basically just lab testings of the tissue. Um, yeah, breast cancer it's like these malignant ones are a leading cause of cancer-related deaths worldwide, so it is a really big issue. And new tools like AI models and CNNs can also be used to help doctors spot cancer earlier and more accurately, along with these other methods. Some treatments for breast cancer include surgery, in which you could remove the tumor or the whole breast, known as mastectomy, radiation therapy, which basically uses like energy rays to kill the cancer cells, or there's chemotherapy, which I'm sure you guys have heard of that before. It basically just uses strong drugs that kill and like slow down the cancer growth. There's also hormone therapy, which blocks hormones like estrogen, which fuels like these cancers. And there's other like targeted therapies like immunotherapy, which are more modern treatments that try to attack the cancer more precisely. But if we can detect these cancers earlier on, it is a lot easier to treat it. Earlier treatment can lead to patients living a lot longer and healthier lives. So now, like implementing the CNN into our model to detect these malignant and benign tumors, just like thinking of back to like what Devsha was explaining earlier, thinking about the different layers of our CNN model. So in our earlier layer, it's gonna be detecting like the edges of, so it's gonna be looking at these images, and it's gonna be detecting the images, it's gonna be looking at like light versus darker boundaries. It's gonna try to notice the texture of the cell, whether it's smooth or rough, and it's going to just recognize simple shapes. In the middle layers, it's going to be building patterns, which is like it's going to combine basics into cell structures. It's just picking up on or unusual tissue patterns, distinguishing between so smoother and organized growth is a benign tumor, while chaotic and irregular growth is a malignant one. Then in these deeper layers, it's going to be looking at the whole bigger picture. It's piecing everything together to understand the whole tumor image, and it's going to decide whether it's benign if it's well formed and contained, or if it's malignant if it's irregular or invasive. And so now that we like know what we're going to be doing with our project, there's just one more thing we want to cover. It's another important library that we're going to be using today with our CNN. This is known as PyTorch. So PyTorch is a Python library used for deep learning. It's built around tensors. Tensors are basically just multi-dimensional arrays. Like if you remember, arrays are just like more complex lists. They can run on a GPU, making it like computations a lot faster. So there's different like types of tensors. They can represent scalars, which are single numbers, or vectors, which are 1D arrays. Matrices are 2D arrays, and then images are the 3D arrays. They have like three different arguments: channels, height, and width. That's what we're going to be looking at in our project today, the images. And PyTorch is just a widely used for research and teaching because it's easy to understand and it's flexible. It has a lot of different tools and methods that are really helpful for us to use in evaluating the images. And I'm just gonna send the link to the notebook.
And while Aveen is sending the link out for the notebook, we just want to ask you guys to stay till the end of class because we want to discuss our team with you or basically our cool leadership opportunities that we are releasing or have released. And we also have a form for you guys that we'd love for you guys to fill out to help us personally. So if you guys enjoyed our class, we'd really appreciate it if you guys fill out the form that we're going to send out at the end of class. So staying at the end of class would be appreciated. We have some important things to go over.
Okay, yeah, and I just shared the notebook too, so make sure you guys all make a copy of it. You guys can save all your edits and things.
So if you guys forgot how to do that, just go over to File and then click Save a Copy in Drive. It should create a new tab for you guys.
I'll
Aveen,
give
can
you
you see
guys a
my screen?
moment. Yeah,
Okay, cool.
I'll give you guys a second to do that, and then we'll get started. Okay, so hopefully you guys were all able to make your own copy. Just to like give a little overview of what our project is doing again, basically what we're going to be doing in our breast cancer image classifier, we're going to be teaching the computer to look at breast cancer images and decide whether a tumor is benign, whether it's not harmful, or if it's malignant, if it's cancerous and dangerous. So it's going to be implementing CNNs, just like a simple um, overview of a CNN, like we just discussed, like Devshi went into full detail. It's a convolutional neural network. There's special types of neural networks that are really good at understanding images. That's just like a really simple definition. They can detect patterns like the edges, the shapes, the textures in the images. That's what's going to be helping us tell if the tumor is safe or dangerous. And then again, this project is just so impactful for the real world because these kinds of AI models are what are going to help doctors catch cancer earlier and make faster diagnosis. It's just showing us how deep learning can be used in medical imaging to like save lives. And to get started, like always, we're going to be installing and importing some libraries. The code for this first cell should already be there for you guys, so you don't have to like retype it all again. So the first thing we're going to be installing is Kaggle Hub. Basically, this is just a tool that it just makes it easier for us to download data sets from Kaggle directly into our notebook instead of having to like go outside of the notebook. So it's just like installing Kaggle Hub. And then the dash Q, it just means quiet, so it doesn't like spam the screen with unnecessary messages or anything. And then next we have import PyTorch. So just like we explained on the other slide, PyTorch is this library that we're going to be using. It just helps us work with tensors, which are like arrays or matrices. We're going to be looking at 3D arrays for the images, and it just runs on the GPU. It just runs computations a lot faster. And then some of the specific tools we're going to be using is torch.nn, which it just contains the building blocks for neural networks, like the layers, like the convolutions and the fully connected layers. And also it contains the activation functions. The other thing we're going to be importing is torch.optim, which it just provides the optimizers. Like if you guys remember in our last project, we used Atom. Another example of an optimizer is SGD. This is just helping the model learn by updating the weights during the training. We also have Torch Vision. This is a package that works well with PyTorch with like images. It just provides ready-made data sets and tools to transform these images. Data sets, so it's also importing data sets and transforms. So the data sets, it just lets us load like these standard data sets from the stored folders like our breast cancer images. And transforms, it's allowing us to pre-process these images, for example, like resizing them or converting them to tensors or flipping them. And then we also are getting from torch utilities.data, we're importing data loader and subset. Data loader is used to efficiently download or efficiently load our data set into smaller batches for training. So we're not looking at like a giant data set all at once. It makes it a lot easier. And then subset, it's basically just helping with that. It's getting a smaller part of our data set, which is just useful for like faster testing. Like in our case, we're just creating like a simple version of it for demonstration. So it's just making that a lot easier. And then like always, we're also going to be importing matplotlib, just like we did for our other projects too. It just helps us visualize images, create graphs or other results. We're just going to be using it to look at example images from our data set. And NumPy as we're going to be using it for numerical operations to like manipulate these arrays more easily. And then lastly, we're also going to be importing random, which we just use this to select random images from the data set to like display or to test our predictions with. It just helps us so that each time we're going to be looking at a different example. And I don't know, we accidentally repeated the matplotlib, so just don't worry about that. And so hopefully you guys just run that cell so we can import all of it. And then in our next step, we're going to be actually downloading the data set. So we're going to be downloading this breast cancer images from Kaggle using the Kaggle.hub. So we would just do import Kaggle hub. This is just like the tool that's like, we don't have to leave the notebook to directly download it since we already installed the Kaggle hub thing earlier too.
Wait, a quick note.
And
Oh, sorry, I mean one quick
you're
note.
good.
I think if you guys want, we're gonna finish this cell here and then I'll send it in the chat because we have to pull the data set from someone's like from kind of like a directory and the directory like username is really long. So I don't think I want you to spend that much time typing all that out. So we're just look at my screen and we'll finish typing it out and I'll copy the cell and paste it into the chat so you guys can do it there. But this is not that important. This is just for us to get the data set from Kaggle. In normal projects, you typically download it yourself and put it into the file thing on the left. So don't worry about like wondering why are we doing this. This is just to make it easier for everyone to get the proper files that we need fast.
Yeah. And yeah, basically just like Darsha was saying, we only need to also install this once too, so we can use it for many like Kaggle data sets instead of having to like, just like Darsha was saying, instead of having to download it and put it in the file like manually yourself.
I'm just
And
gonna like copy paste the code into this.
yeah.
So it's a little easier because I don't think it's that important.
Hmm.
Give
So
me
now we're gonna,
20
oh,
seconds.
sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah,
give
you're
me
good.
20 seconds to get it.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's the code there. I think Darsha said she's gonna send it to you guys so you guys can just copy paste it and add it into your own text cell too. I mean your own code cell as well. So yeah, we went over what the import Kaggle Hub does, and then the path is equal to Kaggle Hub dot dataset download. Basically, this is just like it's downloading this multi-cancer dataset into our like local files. And if the dataset is already downloaded, it's not going to download it again. It's just giving us a path to this folder. Yeah, the variable path is just like it's containing all this cancer data. And then looking at this other variable, data underscore path, what this is doing is it's looking deeper inside of the data set because there's so many different kinds of cancer within this like multi-cancer data set. But like for our project, we only need to look at breast cancer images. So it's just pointing directly to these benign and malignant images. So PyTorch can load it a lot easier. And then when you run it, it just like outputs that it's using Colab Cache for faster access to the multi-cancer data set. So hopefully you guys got a chance to copy that and run that so then all of your files are downloaded. And then moving on to our next step, we're going to be transforming these images. Um, So before we actually like feed these images into the neural network, we want them all to be the same size and the right format because different images, they may have like different resolutions. So we want to like resize them to 64 by 64 pixels for like consistency. So to do this, we would just do transform is equal to transforms.compose. This compose is just letting us combine multiple transformations into a single step so we don't have to like apply each transformation to each individual image repeatedly. And then within this dot compose, we're going to be doing transforms dot resize and then in parentheses 64 comma 64. This is just resizing all the images to 64 by 64 pixels. I think it's shrinking them. Um, And then another thing we're going to be doing is transforms.toTensor, which is just converting all of these images from like regular image format to PyTorch tensors, which is the format that our model is going to understand. And basically what it's doing is so originally our pixels are within the range of values from 0 to 255, I think. This is just scaling it down to 0. So now the pixel values is going to range from 0 to 1. So it's changing it from integers to floats. We're getting an error. Um,
One
okay,
sec.
let's see.
Let me see
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah, make sure you guys are all like running all of your cells. That's really important. So you guys are like downloading all of the
Yeah,
imports
so
and
I
stuff
forgot
that we
to
need.
run the import cell, so it was confused as to where to get that stuff from. Okay, there we go.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So now that we've transformed the images, yeah, so this last part, the transform to tensor, is changing the values from integers between 0 to 205 to floats now. So now the values are going to be ranging from 0 to 1. And the reason why we do this, it's just a lot easier for the neural network to understand. That's really the only reason why. So hopefully you guys got to run that. It's not going to output anything. It's just all happening behind the scenes. Yeah, so we saw this earlier too. It was taking a long time to download. The data set is pretty large. One thing you could check if it's taking too long, it's if you go all the way um, at the top bar and you click runtime, and then you scroll down to change runtime type, you want to make sure that instead of using CPU, you're using T4 GPU, because that is a lot faster. If you try that, hopefully it will run faster.
The reason behind that is that like GPUs are a lot faster than TPUs or CPUs, and basically Colab gives us free access to these GPUs to use, so might as well go and use them. How do you check that again? You go over up here or on this like kind of panel thing to runtime, and then once you click that, scroll down to change runtime type, and then in that click T4 GPU. It's only 40% through after 3 minutes. Hmm. That's odd. Let me. I wanted. It's okay, Evelyn. I think the data set is just a big one in general, so it does take time. Oftentimes in like real world projects, it takes up like some I know I've heard in some projects it takes up to an hour to download data because of the sheer amount that people use. So it's perfectly normal. We're willing to wait until everything gets downloaded so you can catch up. But I'm sure other people are also having this like slowness issue, but really that's only because of the size of the data set that we need to get.
I think all the other cells should be running faster too after that's all downloaded and it should be going a lot smoother. Yeah, but I think if we go on to step 4, so yeah, hopefully like your guys' things are all downloading and then you can run the other previous cells. But just moving on, in our next step, we're gonna be actually like loading the data set and the subset. We're just gonna load all the images and their labels, whether they're benign or malignant, and then we're gonna split the data into batches of I think six. We're actually gonna split the data into batches. We made it a little smaller into 8 images so the computer can train efficiently. And we're gonna keep the class name so we can label the pictures later. So to do this, we're creating a variable dataset is equal to datasets.image folder, and then in parentheses, data path, comma, transform is equal to transform. Image folder is also a PyTorch tool that is basically just loading the images from the folder structure. It's automatically also assigning labels based on the subfolder names. Like for example, benign is equal to 0 and malignant is equal to 1. And the transform equal to transform, we're just doing that so that each image is like resized and converted to a tensor automatically. So that's what's happening in that line of code. And then for our next line of code, we're going to be doing train underscore loader. We're creating another variable is equal to data loader. And then within those parentheses, data set, comma, batch size is equal to 8, comma, shuffle is equal to true. So here, data loader is letting us load the data set into smaller batches instead of all at once. So here we're going to be doing batch size is equal to 8. So we're going to be using 8 images per batch. This also helps the model run a lot more efficiently because we saw this problem earlier too when we were trying to run it. This was also making it go a lot slower. So if we like decrease the batch size, it is going to like go a lot more efficiently. And then shuffle is equal to true. What it's doing, it's just like mixing the images in every epoch, which is helping the model learn better because it's like preventing bias from like image order. So like it's gonna be looking at them like in a more random order instead of like an organized thing that it's just gonna the model's just gonna pick up on that pattern instead of actually learning like what the images are representing. And then we're gonna do class underscore names is equal to dataset dot classes. And then we could even just print this out with like classes colon is comma last name. We're just displaying the variable. Um, well, this is basically doing the dataset.classes. It's just returning a list of the class names that PyTorch is getting from the subfolder inside of like this data path. So for our projects specifically, our breast cancer folder has two subfolders, benign and malignant. These are the two class names. The data set, it's going to return benign and malignant. That's why we can see in the output when you run it, it like prints out breast benign, breast malignant. So this is really useful because when the model is actually going to make its predictions, it's outputting a class index. It's going to either output 0 or 1, but we don't necessarily know like what that could be representing. So now that we've like created this class names variable, we've like looked at the actual names of these subfolders, it's going to change that index. It's going to map that index back to its actual like human readable label, which is the benign or malignant, instead of 0 or 1. It just makes it easier for us to understand.
Have your
I'll
guys'
give you guys,
data sets downloaded yet?
none of my cells are even starting to run.
Some Samia or Samaya, are you on the GPU instead of CPU? Have you done that yet? Mine's is fine. Okay, good to know. You're on GPU. Did the import statement work? That should work. I do suppose this could also have to do with internet speed
Yeah.
and how much resources your computer has in particular, because I know you guys are also on Zoom, right? So Zoom also consumes some of your computing power from your computer, so it's not able to fully devote all of its power to Colab. So that might also be a reason that your guys' code is running slowly. Um, in the case that it's going so slow to the point that cells aren't even running, we'd recommend you guys. Right? Okay, cool. Um, if it's not working, then just go ahead and like after class, you can rewatch the recording. We'll put it out as soon as possible, and you can follow along with us. and then do it separately. Just because maybe Zoom is probably making your guys' computer slower.
Yeah, and we're gonna be posting the completed notebook later on too. So if you guys just want to watch us now and like pick up what we're doing currently, instead of like typing it up yourself if it's taking too long, then you guys can always go back later.
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully your guys' code starts running a little bit faster. If not, it's all good. But yeah, you could always do that. You could always just write the code and run it later on. It might, hopefully later on, like if you're like off Zoom or something, it will run faster. But yeah, so moving on to our fifth step, we're gonna be actually visualizing the sample images. This is important because like we always want to check our data before training our model. We're going to be showing 6 sample images with their labels. This just helps you to see like what the model is actually going to be learning from. It's like instead of like we know that we have this data set, but if we want to actually like see a visualization of what these images are, this is what we're going to be doing in this step. So first we're going to create like 2 variables, images comma labels is equal to next, and then in parentheses iter, and then in parentheses train loader. So what this line is doing, basically train loader is like, you like think of it like a bucket of our data set. It just contains the batches of images and their labels. It's like all ready for training and visualization. And then the iter is just converting this like data loader into an iterator. So like we can be looking at each of these batches one by one. And then the next part, it's just grabbing that first batch of images from the iterator. And then images and labels. Images, it's a tensor containing the batch of images. It's like you could think of it's like arguments like batch size, channels, height, and width. And then for labels, it just has the argument of batch size. And I know that kind of doesn't make sense, but like one analogy that I found that like I like that made sense to me, it was like you could think of the train loader as like a loaf of sliced bread. And then the iter part, it's just like picking the slices of bread to look at. And then the next part, it's just choosing that first slice. So it's choosing that first batch of images. That's basically what it's doing. And in our next line of code, we're doing fig comma axis is equal to plt dot subplots, and then in parentheses 1 comma 6 comma fig size is equal to 12 comma 4. What this is basically doing, it's just like reconfiguring, like it's creating a figure with 1 row and 6 columns to display these 6 images side by side. That's all it's doing. And then the fig size 12 comma 4, it's just making sure that the figure is wide enough for like clarity. So it's just like to make sure that it all looks neat and organized when it's gonna actually display the images. And next we're gonna actually create our for loop. So we're gonna do for I in range 6 to look at our first 6 images of our batch. And then we would do image img is equal to images, and then we're gonna have index of I dot permute 1 comma 2 comma 0, and then dot numpy, and then open and close parentheses. Um, Basically what this like permute line of code is doing, basically, so PyTorch originally it has this like I guess you would call like arguments. It's in the order of channels, height, and width. So channels is basically like if you think of an RGB image, like a regular colored image, the channels is basically it's either a red, green, or blue channel. And then height would be like 64 pixels tall and width would be 64 pixels wide. But in matplotlib, when we're going to be actually displaying this image, it's in a different order. It goes height, width, and then channels. So what this permute tool is doing, it's basically just reordering the axes. So axis 0 is the channels. It's moving that to the end. That's why it's like at the end of the argument. And then axis 1, that's representing the height. So it's going to keep that first. Then axis 2, that's representing the width. So it's going to stay second. So it's basically just like reordering these like arguments so that when it's going to display the image using the subplot, using the matplotlib, it will actually work correctly. And yeah. And then one is access index one dot IAM show and then in parentheses image. And our other lines of code too is just access index one dot set title, in parentheses class names, and then in brackets we have labels, index of I. And then lastly, we would just have access index one dot access and then in parentheses off. These are just like adding like headings and titles to um when we're gonna be actually displaying it. So like the axis.im show, it's just showing the image in the subplot. And then the next line, the dot set title, it's just setting the title of this subplot to the class name. So whether it's benign or whether it's malignant, that's what it's going to be displaying. And then the dot axis part, it's just hiding the ticks and numbers. Like when like the matplotlib, like normally it's going to be displaying like a graph. We don't necessarily need that in this case. We just want to display the images. So it's just hiding like the ticks and the numbers just for a cleaner display. And then lastly, to actually display all six of the images, we would just do pl3.show. And then when you run this cell, we can actually see each of like these six images. So here we have, oh, but that's weird. I don't know why all of our images are malignant. Maybe we could try running it again. Oh, that's really interesting. Like now, earlier I was testing it and it was showing like a mix of benign and malignant. Oh yeah, you can see here. So it's like randomly selecting these six images based on whatever batch it's looking at. But we see like we look at each of these images that's being displayed, and then the class of the image is also being displayed above it. So this is what our data set is made up of. This is what the model is going to be training off of, and this is what it's going to be like looking at these images to make predictions later on. Yeah, so hopefully you guys got that to run. And yeah, now I'll just hand it off to Dakshri, and she's going to actually be helping you guys create the CNN model.
All right, so I do see someone has getting an error called axes is not defined. So axes is something from the matplotlib library, if I'm not mistaken. So really, it should be already in your code, basically. Like if you imported it, axes should already be there. Make sure are you spelling axes with an E? You are. Okay. Is anyone else getting the error that says axes is not defined?
Yeah, you should have it in that like line of code above the for loop where it says fig comma axes is equal to.
Yeah,
Um,
make sure you guys didn't miss this
yeah.
line of code right here. Because this is where we're actually making the axes. So here yeah, okay, that's the problem. Okay. So I'll give you like maybe 5 seconds to take a look at that, and then I will be moving on. Always remember if something says not defined, everyone, go back and check if you ever gave it a value. Because in Python, you need to give variables value for them to be defined. So in this case, we are giving axes a value in this line. All right, I'm gonna move on now. So Aveen gave you guys a really cool visualization of our data set right here through this chunk of code. If taking a look at this, we see a mix of our malignant and benign tissues. So remember, benign is perfectly safe and malignant is dangerous. So that is what we want to detect and say, no, that's bad. So if you guys are getting only one kind of data, if you guys only see breast benign or only see breast malignant, just keep rolling again because this is just pulling like random batches. So if you run it again, you'll see a different set of data. So it's actually really cool because this is the real cells from. Is it compulsory for us to follow the project right now because you're finding it hard to follow along? No, Zonaira, it's not compulsory. So you guys are, that's the reason we go ahead and post everything after class for you guys to go back and look at because we understand it can be a lot to cover in 2 hours. Okay, moving on. So this is like a nice visualization of the cells inside of a tumor basically, or basically tumor visualizations. So through this, you can kind of just get an idea of what we're dealing with here. And from our eyes, we're not exactly able to tell what's malignant and what's benign, but somehow the model will, and that's the really crazy cool part about this. Okay, so until now, all we've done is really get our data, take a look at it, maybe change the shape of it a little bit so it works in our model. But now it's time to actually make our CNN. So again, CNN is a convolutional neural network. It's good for images. We're going to be making a two-layer convolutional neural network that will look at the patterns in our images. We will be incorporating pooling, which if you guys forgot, pooling is basically how we compress the images, make it a little smaller for the model to only look at the important features rather than everything. We're going to be flattening the image just for it to become readable for the model. And finally, we're going to be applying an activation function to, which if you guys remember, happens inside neurons. We're going to be applying an activation function in order to get to our final output. So now this code is a little bit complex, so I will go slowly. It does deal with something called classes. So if you guys aren't familiar with that, you guys will learn what that is today. So first of all, we're going to start by defining a class. Now, if you guys don't know what a class is basically a group of code. So it's a group of related code that accomplishes a certain task. So to do this, we're going to do the signature of a class, or basically how you do a class, which is really simple. It's just the word class, then your name of the class. We're going to do CNN, and then create a set of parentheses, and within the parentheses, input nn dot module, like this. So make sure you guys have this line of code if you guys are following along. So what this is doing is basically pulling from this library. We're able to take this library and incorporate it into our CNN class, which we will be using to construct our whole neural network architecture. So don't worry about what this does yet. We'll see it in action in just a second. Okay, now that we've created a class header, we need to give it something called a constructor. Now, a constructor in code or in classes specifically is basically this first line that executes when you call the class. It's basically the chunk of code that initializes the class, that sets up basically the object of a class. Now, that's a lot of terms, but just know that this constructor that we're about to make is kind of like a setup. It basically gets everything prepped and ready to be applied functions on, basically. So in order to do this, we're going to do def init with two underscores on both sides, self super CNN, comma self dot init. Now you're probably like, what does init mean? What is self? Well, first of all, init is just a general signature in Python to create a constructor. So this name is just what everyone uses for constructors typically. Remember, a constructor is something that's basically doing the setup for our network. So here we're calling upon super. Um, one moment, guys. Right, okay. So we can actually make this a little bit easier for ourselves. I realize that many of you guys may not be exactly familiar with with classes. So all you guys have to do is super in parentheses dot in it. And this is basically calling the constructor method this thing and setting up our architecture. Just think of it like initializing our architecture. That's it. All right. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and start making the actual layers. So remember on my slideshow, I talked about those convolutional layers, all those different kind of layers um, that basically allow the network to function. We're going to be defining each one of them here and now. So let's start by creating our first convolutional layer, because after we get the input, naturally convolutional layers comes next because we want to start running our kernels on them. So the way we create a convolutional layer is actually fairly simple. We do self which refers to basically the model. It's kind of the object of the class, if you guys are familiar with that phrase. If you're not familiar with that phrase, self is just basically an instance. Like the specific model that we're working with, it just refers to that. We're going to do self.conv1, which basically sets our convolutional layer number one, is equal to nn.conv2d. And now we're going to give it some parameters that are important. So first we're going to give it the parameter 3. So what the first parameter of 3 does is it basically lets the layer know that we have 3 channels. So we're dealing with colorful images here, right? So we have red, green, blue, and this channel variable always refers to basically how many like scopes of color we have. So if it's just a grayscale image, there's only one channel. But since we have RGB, we have to specify that there's 3 channels. After that, we're gonna do 16, and this parameter here basically tells us how many feature maps that we want to generate from this layer. So remember, we can have different amounts of feature maps, but we have to specify how many you want. Typically, you just put a number and then tweak it as you go, if you want to adjust it. I just chose 16 because it sounded like a good number to me. But we're going to do 16 feature maps. And then finally, we have to specify the size of the kernel that we want. So the size of the kernel, remember it's a matrix, so it is a grid of values, okay? And we need to specify what the dimensions of that kernel are. So we're going to say 3. So this means that the kernel is going to be 3 by 3, just like how it was in the slide. And finally, we're going to introduce something called a padding. If you're wondering, how is if the image is not perfectly divisible by 3, like if the rows are not perfectly divisible by 3, how are the kernels going to get every part of the image? And the way we do that is padding. So padding basically adds an extra layer of pixels around that allows our kernels to basically return basically an even number of things read. So instead of it reading like half of a pixel in the end, padding makes sure that it's all a whole number and everything is read successfully. Um, okay. Next, we're gonna move on to our second convolutional layer. Um, One moment, guys. Second convolutional layer, and the way we define this is basically the exact same thing as the first one, except you can just copy paste it actually and change the name of the variable to make things quicker. So instead of self conv1, we're going to do self dot conv2. So that just shows us our second layer is called convolutional layer 2. We aren't gonna mess with the amount of feature maps or anything for this because it works perfectly fine without having to mess with it. But all you gotta know is that this basically defines a layer and it takes in the number of channels, basically color things, colorways. It takes into account how many feature maps you want produced, the size of the kernel, that matrix, and introduces something called a padding, which basically can fill in for extra pixels if needed for the kernel to evenly read all of the image. Okay, now we are going to the some questions. The For the underscore after def and in it, did you just put one underscore? No. So this is 2 underscores right here. That's the typical convention. Perfect. So make sure you guys have 2 underscores next to init. Again, if you're wondering why is it called init, that's just the way that Python or most programmers, that's just the convention that they use to define a constructor. So don't worry about like where'd you get that name from. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and introduce our pooling layer. So if you guys remember, our pooling layer is that layer that basically downsizes our feature maps and only preserves the important information. So again, this is also a simple line of code. It's just self.pool is equal to neural network or NN dot max pool 2D, and we're gonna give it the inputs of 2 and 2. This basically all it does is it just reduces the width and height by a factor of 2, so that's our compression that's going on. Yes. second, guys. Let me go ahead and hold on, I'm getting an error. Let me just go ahead and fix that, and then I'll get to your guys' questions. Okay, I'm just playing around with indentation because I am getting an indentation error. So if you guys are getting that too, don't worry. Indentation errors are really easy to solve. You just have to play around with how the indentation looks like. Okay, there we go. I fixed it. So the error was is that some of the lines were extra indentated than others. So yes, they should have had the same indentation. So make sure everything is after the def in itself, everything is on the same indentation. So just to make it easier to see, I kind of moved everything right next to each other. You guys don't have to do that, but you guys can follow along if you want. I just moved everything right next to each other so we can actually see the indentation. Hannah, indentation just means like this white space before the actual line. So, for example, this, if I indent it more, it looks like that. If I indent it more, it looks like that. Basically, want everything to be in the same like parallel structure, basically. Okay, you guys should not be getting any errors now. If everything should be indented in the same place. Hello, Anais. Welcome back. Okay, so now that we've basically created three layers, essentially, we've created our first convolutional layer, we've created our second convolutional layer, and now we've created a pooling layer to only get our most important features or our biggest values, basically, as you can see from Max. Now we have to go ahead and flatten our images or our outputs just to make everything easier for the model to understand. But before we do that, we need to make one more kind of definition, and that's something called self.fc. Now, what self.fc does is that it basically defines, it kind of is like a placeholder for a variable that tells if the model should be fully connected or not. So let's just define this and then I'll explain what exactly it does. So you're just going to assign this to none. What self.fc does is it creates a placeholder variable that basically lets the model know if every neuron in the network has to be connected or not. So don't worry about what this means for now because it just stands for none. It doesn't have a real value yet. But eventually, when we do give it value, and if we give it value, I will tell you guys exactly how that works. But for now, just create this fully connected um, definition for now and make it none. So it has no variable right now. Alrighty, so if everyone has gotten there, we'll move on to our next step. And our next step is where we actually implement these layers into practice. So the way that convolutional neural networks do this is through defining a second function, which kind of takes everything we defined here and kind of calls upon it in a way. So the way we do that is now we have to make a new function. So you can de-indent a little bit to go back. We're not in the constructor anymore. So you guys can de-indent. And we're going to create a function called forward. So again, this is just naming convention. Forward is basically the function that's going to detail in what order do we want these layers in and basically kind of set up the entire order of everything. So we're going to give it some parameters here. So we're going to give it self and x. So we're basically feeding in the object of the class and then second parameter x, which I'll show you guys what that means in just a second. To create this new function using the def signature and feed it in the value self, which is kind of our model. It's just the model itself, and then the parameter x. All right, once you've done that, we're gonna kind of apply our first couple of convolutions. So remember, convolution were those math operations that we went over where the kernels slide over everything. And the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna do x is equal to self dot pool f dot ReLU, sorry, torch dot ReLU, self dot conv1 of x. So this is a pretty packed line of code, so I'll dissect it for you guys. What it's doing is it's calling upon, first of all, our first convolutional layer. Okay, so this is a call, as you guys can see. After it calls upon that, it's applying our activation function. So if you guys came last class, you'd be familiar with the ReLU function. And the ReLU function basically is an activation function that makes all the values positive. It determines again whether you want to send the input forward or not. So we apply our activation function on that convolutional neural network layer. And finally, we pool that layer together. So what that pool is, if you guys remember, is we are simply just getting the most important features. We're kind of downsizing or downsampling is the term for that layer. All right, so now that we've called upon our first layer, we basically have to do the same thing with our second. So you guys can honestly just copy paste that first line like that, and then change conv1 to conv2. So we're doing the same thing. We're calling upon the convolutional neural network. We're basically making it. We're applying the activation function to it. And then finally, we're pooling it. So in the end, we're only left with the most important feature maps with the most important values. So that's what this is doing. So it's basically calling many things in one line. I'll give you guys like 10 seconds to do that. We're almost done. Okay. Now we're gonna go ahead and move on to flattening our basically the output of this. Now the reason we do that is so it's easy for the model to process and it's like easy for it to understand. So the way we do that is actually really simple. We do x is equal to x dot view, my monitor here, x dot size, 0, and then we do -1. Next, to explain what's going on here, we're basically giving it batch size and features. These are just standard for now, that allow us to just like flatten everything at once on one go, as easy as that. So basically what we're doing in this line is that we're changing the view to a flattened 1D vector instead of 2D, and we're basically making it easier for the model to read and understand. All right. Now we're going to go and create an if statement to detect if the fully connected, to basically understand the fully connected layer idea. So we're going to basically try to understand, as this comment says, we're going to define the fully connected layer the first time forward runs. And this is done because now we finally know how many features the flattened tensor has, and we know how many outputs that it wants. So we know how we assigned fully connected to none. We're basically going to edit that value a little bit, or return it so the model knows how many features there are based on the output. So the way we do that is if self.fc is none, which it is none on the first time our forward runs, or this function runs, because we initialize it using the none. Self.fc will be equal to nn.linear x.size of 1 and then 2. So here we're kind of updating it now. It's no longer none, but it actually has value, which makes this a fairly connected network. Now we're not done. We're going to also call this thing called to device, or sorry, to x dot device, and this will basically let us know, it'll basically output our outputs essentially. So as simple as that. Make sure indentation is correct, so your second line is after the conditional itself. Though I know the explanation was kind of confusing for this, just know that we've created a fully connected layer. Now we've basically connected our layers all together using this. So now that we've created our fully connected layer, we have to pass our data, or yeah, essentially our data and images through this interconnected network. So the way we do that is return self.fc of x. So again, remember fc stands for fully connected. We're basically going to call upon this once again and send our data all through it to basically get an output. So make sure everything is inside the forward function, so it's indented. And this line after the if should be indented one more to show that it's inside the if conditional. Unlike Java and other languages, Python actually cares about how much spaces you have or indents. So if you're wondering if it's important, it's really important. It'll throw you an error, as we saw earlier, if it's not done properly. Okay, so we're almost done. Why we have to do a little bit of housekeeping, so this next couple steps are fairly intuitive. We're gonna first, for speed purposes, because I know we were having some speed, we're gonna introduce this one line. I'm gonna add it to our file. We're gonna make it select the GPU. Instead, we're gonna select the GPU to make it faster automatically for you guys so you don't have to manually do that. So all we're gonna do for this is we're gonna do device is equal to CUDA. Now, if you're wondering what this is, it's basically kind of an API provided by NVIDIA, helps us run stuff a little faster. So it's gonna check if it's available. So we're kind of doing like a if else statement in like one line to just make it faster. We're basically gonna check, we're basically gonna let it know that we want it to use a GPU if it's available, and if not, use a CPU. This is just to make your guys' code run a little bit faster. Once you guys have typed that out, we finally have to call upon our entire model. So we've created this nice little class here, right? Now we have to call our class for us to actually define and instantiate our model. So the way we do that is model is equal to CNN, which is our class, dot to, and then put in our device in there so it'll operate on whatever device we give it. Um, to device. And this will basically call upon this entire class to kind of construct our good old network. So if you guys want to go ahead and run that, check for any errors. I'm not getting any. If you guys want, you can also like print the device if you want to see like what your model chose to run on. If you guys have the GPU or not, good way to check. So for me, it's running on my GPU because it prints out CUDA, which is an NVIDIA thing basically. NVIDIA is the one that makes all these GPUs and CPUs. So it's printing out CUDA, which shows me that it is running on the faster GPU. If it shows CPU for you guys, that might explain why it's running slowly. Okay, but I'll give you guys like 10 seconds to kind of catch up. All right. So what we did in this step, if you guys didn't understand anything, we have some questions. I mean, could you answer Aeneas' questions? Hannah, NVIDIA is basically a giant, like a $1 billion, maybe even $1 trillion company, if I'm not mistaken. It's a giant company that makes GPUs and CPUs, which is what's inside your computer that allows your computer to kind of process code. And they're known for making really powerful GPUs or processing units that allow AI code to be executed really fast and efficiently. It's just a company that makes everything. Okay, so now we're almost done. Just three more steps and some fairly easy steps to go, and then we'll finally have a working breast cancer model. So what we did in this last step, if you guys didn't understand anything, if you guys had to take away one thing from this, is that we kind of defined our CNN. We made our layers, we called upon our layers, and we basically told it what device to use. We told it to use the faster GPU if it has access to it. So that's what this is. It just made our layers and it just kind of called upon that class that we made of CNN to define it. That's it. We basically constructed the architecture in this block of code. Now we're going to be doing losses and optimizers. So if you guys remember, models train through back propagation, right? And if you remember that GIF that we saw earlier, we saw it gets its output, it calculates a loss function, so it finds out how far off it was, and then goes back and adjusts those weights to make a better prediction. So the algorithms that allow it to do that are called loss and optimizers. So optimizers basically how it adjusts the weights, how it learns, and loss is the actual function that allows the model to see how accurate it was in the first place. So let's go ahead and first create our loss function. So we're gonna give it we're gonna put it inside a variable. We're gonna do criterion is equal to nn.cross entropy loss. Now cross entropy is a specific loss function that allows the model to understand how far off it is from its actual predictions. Now cross entropy is typically used for neural networks. That's why we're using it here. The formula is very large and complex. So if you guys want to learn what that is, you can let us know, but it's a little bit much to cover in one lesson. So we are not going over exactly what it does, but all you need to know is that this is what's typically used in CNNs and it allows the model to understand its accuracy. Finally, we're going to pass in an optimizer, which basically tells the model how to exactly learn or how to adjust the weights. So the optimizer that we're going to be using is called Atom. I'm not exactly sure why they named it that, but Atom is the optimizer that we are going to be using. If you're wondering what this line of code does, it basically sets up the Atom optimizer, and it introduces a variable or parameter called learning rate, and that's basically how fast you want it to learn. So that's what that is. So 0.001 is the how fast it's gonna learn. You don't want it to learn too fast. You want it to start slow, just so the model doesn't just skips over things and just learns random stuff instead of actually learning what's important. So we want to give it time. So this is a good learning rate for now. We're basically feeding in the parameters and then our learning rate. So this basically gives the optimizer a good idea of what's going to get inputted and then how it should approach that input to calculate proper weights. So this was just a couple of things to um, allow the model to assess itself and fix itself. So this has to do with training. But now we have to actually implement this training into the model, and this is honestly our last long piece of code. So going over a couple key vocab terms before we approach this block of code. So this is kind of like a big master block. We refer to how many times a model runs through as an epoch. So an epoch is basically what iteration it's on of training because the model doesn't just go through once and then output its final thing. No, it goes back and it runs again and it goes and calculates the weights and goes again and again. We need to tell it how many times we want it to do that. So the way we do that is through defining something called epochs. So we're gonna give it a certain number of epochs or basically how many times we want it to run. And then we're going to be going through batches of images and we're going to be looking at the images and predicting out the labels, checking how strong those labels are, and we're going to be basically telling the model to update itself if it gives us a wrong prediction. So first, to accomplish these tasks, let's start by creating two lists to store the accuracy and loss values after every epoch. So after every iteration, we want to see what the loss looks like and what the accuracy looks like. So this just helps us evaluate how, um, you know, how good the model is essentially. So here we're creating two lists in one line. So if you don't be confused by what this line is doing, we're creating a list called train losses and train accuracies can name it whatever you want, but this is typically good convention. All we're doing is creating two lists to store train losses and train accuracy so we can view them later. All right, now let's get into real training. So we're gonna set it small for now because we know that your guys' computers are kind of acting up and how fast it can run this. But we're gonna basically training two epochs. So we're gonna have the model go through twice before making its final prediction. So the way we do that is with a for loop. So we're gonna do for epoch in range two. So it's gonna repeat this whatever code we put under this two times. We want to go ahead and create three variables, correct, total, and running underscore loss. And we're going to set these all to 0 for now. We're going to update them later. So just initialize three variables called correct, total, and running loss. It'll help us visualize or better understand the accuracy, really. All right. Now let's go through our batches. So we're at this step right here. For each batch of images, we need to do all these different instructions. So how do we get through all the batches of images? Well, we use data loader and also a for loop. So we're going to do for images, comma labels in train loader. So again, this has all of our data in it, and we're going to access each individual image and its corresponding label. So whether it's benign or malignant. We're gonna do a bit of GPU setup here just to make sure your guys' things are running as fast as possible. I'm not really gonna explain this because it's the same convention as it was before. We're basically sending everything to our GPU to make it run faster. That's all it's doing. So images, comma labels is equal to images to device, which remember we defined earlier as CUDA or CPU. Images to device, labels to device. All this does, it makes it run faster. Nothing functionally really important. All right, now we actually get to training. So what we're gonna do here is start by looking at an optimizer and sending it and calling a function of our optimizer called zero gradient. So zero gradient basically resets it and kind of gives us a fresh start for our model to learn from. So in case optimizer had anything in it, this basically zeroes it and kind of gets it ready for us to recall it and re-update it instead. Now we're gonna call our forward pass. So we're gonna remember, if you remember, we the couple of code blocks earlier, we defined this forward function in the CNN class, which allowed us to actually send our data through the model, send our data forward. We're actually gonna go ahead and use that now. So all we're gonna do is outputs is equal to model of images. So remember, this is just a simple call to the function or that class. We created that value or variable of model that stored the CNN, and we're throwing in the parameter images because that's our input. So this is kind of like a master line. It's a big line because it basically calls the model and sends our images or input through it. So now that the images have been sent through it, the model has made some prediction. We don't know exactly what that is yet, but we don't want to take that prediction as the final one because it's only gone through once, right? We want to see how accurate it was. So we're going to basically calculate the loss. So to do that, we're going to make a new variable called loss, or basically an update. Yeah, we're going to create a new variable called loss. We're going to call upon criterion, which we made earlier, as the loss function, remember? So criterion is the loss function that we're going to be applying here. And we are applying that loss function to the output that the model gave us, and then the label. So basically, it's checking the loss or how accurate it was. All right, now we needed to go backwards. Remember back propagation? After it calculates the loss, it goes back and adjusts those little weights. So to do that, it's pretty cool. The line is simply just loss dot backward. And this will go back and compute gradients or basically compute better values for our weights to make a more accurate prediction. So now that those values have been calculated, we actually need to apply them. And the way we do that is through optimizer.step. So make sure you guys are up to date. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and after that we've updated things, we're going to go and get the predicted class indices, which if you guys recall, Aveen talked about how it returns 0 or 1, and then it maps that 0 or 1 to a class, either benign or malignant. We're basically going to first retrieve those zeros and ones, and then it'll basically allow us to see it in a human readable form in text. So all we do is underscore comma predicted. We're basically making variables here is equal to torch dot max outputs comma 1. So it's kind of giving us what it thinks it is basically. It's returning our predicted class. Now, finally, we want to see how many correct predictions it made as it went through these epochs. And then we want to see our total predictions made, because remember we made these variables up here called correct, total, and running loss, and they're all 0 right now. Let's update them to see how the model actually did. So right now the model knows how well it did, but we don't know how well the model did. So to do that, we're going to update our correct variable to be equal to this following statement. So here we're kind of getting the sum of all of our instances where our prediction actually equaled the labels. So where our prediction equaled the labels, it's getting the sum of how many times that happened. Now let's get our total count basically. So our total is basically just going to be equal to labels dot size of 0. That's just it's just going to let us know how many total predictions it made. And finally, you probably notice that there's one more thing we haven't updated, and that is running loss. So we're gonna see the accumulated loss for this batch. So what's like how much loss has it done throughout the entire course of the batch? The way to do that is just running underscore loss is equal to plus equal to loss dot item. Now, if you're wondering what plus equal operator does, it's basically the same thing as saying running loss is equal to running loss plus whatever you give it. If you're wondering what dot item does, dot item basically returns a view object, so it kind of just allows the variable to pull numbers and compute easily, instead of having to like change data types from here to there and here to there. All right, finally, we're going to calculate our accuracy for epoch. So we're going to do simple math, really. We're going to do correct divided by total, multiplying by 100 to get kind of like a percent value. You don't need that multiplication fully if you don't want to. Or you could just do correct divided by total, whatever format that you're comfortable with. This is basically simple math, right? How do you find a percent? So we're dividing the correct by the total. And finally, all we're gonna do is we're gonna save everything into our little list that we made in the beginning. If you remember, over here we made train losses and train accuracies. So in the future, if you ever want to graph things, then you should save it in little lists. Or if you just want to save information in general, lists are a nice place to store it. So we're gonna do train underscore losses dot append, and we're gonna save running loss divided by the length of our train loader. So we just want to see how much it lost for whatever number of batches. You could also technically do total here, but we're just doing length to show you a different way to access the total of our batch sizes. And finally, we need to append to our second thing. Last, almost done, guys. Train dot accuracy dot append, and simple, we want to append the accuracy. So remember, this is a recall that we made this variable earlier. All these variables we made earlier, and we're basically just storing the accuracy and its loss in lists. And let's go ahead and just print our progress. Now I'm going to use fstring for this just to make it a little easier. If you guys aren't familiar with fstring, don't worry, I'll copy paste this print statement into the chat. Fstring basically allows us to put variables into strings. It's just in a bit of a neater way. Type this out for you guys. You could technically use commas as well, but I just want to show you guys that there's something called F-string and it's pretty cool. You guys should use it. Okay, this should work. Now, what we're doing here is we're pulling certain values from these variables. If you're wondering what are these colons and what are these periods, it's basically retrieving a certain value, kind of like splitting our string or splitting our data into different values to kind of retrieve certain things that we want instead of everything. Because looking at everything at once would be a little bit overwhelming. So this is just printing an informational statement, it doesn't affect the code or anything. So once you guys are done with that, one moment. It seems like I did not define optimizer properly. Okay. 1 second, guys. Okay. So make sure your guys' code is working. Let me know if yours guys isn't working as well. It might take a little bit of time to load because this is the one cell that we're going through different epochs or different kind of like iterations of our thing. So this might also take a long, if it took long to load your data set, it might take long to do this line as well. So don't worry if that doesn't work. Give you guys a couple seconds because I know this was a lot of code. The epochs do take a great amount of time to run, so don't worry if that's not working. Is it taking you guys a long time to run? For me, it is on my monitor. And I see that we're almost out of time, so in order, just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next couple cells so we can get through class and get through our final announcement, which is super exciting. So we're going to move on for now, but the code will run. It'll go through every epoch and run. Could you show the code once again towards the end? Yes, of course. Also, always remember that we will be putting out solutions that work. So remember if you are unable to catch up, just go and refer to the solutions after class. Okay, I know you guys may
If
given
we
good.
have time after class too, we can go over your guys' errors. If we can just
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
finish up.
typically errors are just either syntax errors, you guys misspelled something, or you put in a wrong parameter. We'll go over that in after class. So now for now, just pay attention to the rest of the code. So what we're going to be doing here is basically testing what we just did with a random image. So the way we do this is do IDX is equal to random.randint. This is a predefined function. And what we're doing here is we're basically picking a random index from our data set. Next, let's go ahead and get the image and its label to see what it is. So we're basically feeding this index into our data set to kind of retrieve its data. And finally, we're going to kind of visualize our images using matplotlib. So we're going to do plt.imshow image.permute. We're going to give it our parameters that basically allow it to visualize everything. We're going to feed it through NumPy because it does need an array to understand. And basically changes the shape to a proper form that can be plotted on our graph. We're going to give our graph a title, like so. We're going to go ahead and print out the class names of the label. Almost done, guys. And that should put our title. And we're going to also give it an axis title because we also want to title the axis so you guys know what's going on over there. Just going to turn it off for now because it seems like we don't need it. And finally, we're going to show our graph. through this. So this will basically kind of show you an image that it looked at, what it predicted, and if it got it right or not. Sorry, this will basically show you the image that we're about to feed to the model. And finally, super quickly, we're gonna go ahead and prepare the image for the model, basically size it up into that tensor that Amin talked about earlier. So we're gonna do image underscore tensor is equal to image dot unsqueeze 0, and again, send it to our GPU to do that because it might take some time. So if you run this, even if you run this, you're probably gonna see an image of our one of our cancer cells. And if you notice, it's really pixelated because remember how we have our kernels or our filters that look at every like part of the image? It maps it to pixels, remember? So this kind of gives you a visualization of kind of pixels that are in this tumor cell. It looks pretty cool, honestly. Um, the code will not work right now because my previous line is taking too long to run. So we don't have enough time to wait for that. But just know that this is a nice little visualization to see what your model's actually looking at. All right, and finally, last couple lines of code to actually make a prediction. So far, we just looked at the data that we're going to pass through. To actually make a prediction, we're going to do model.eval. So this kind of shows us that we're evaluating the model now. We're not really training. We're going to do with torch no grad. So again, we don't want it to start calculating gradients now or start calculating weights again, because remember, we're now evaluating the model, not actually editing the model itself. Let's feed it. Let's feed it some data. So we're doing output is equal to model, feeding it that data that we want it to give. And then finally, let's get the index of the highest class. So we're going to do predicted underscore index is equal to torch.argmax. I'll explain what that is. Output, comma, one dot item. Argmax basically looks for the biggest value, the biggest argument. So it looks at the index of the class that was predicted with the highest score. That's basically how it assigns numbers to classes, and it kind of prints out that predicted class. So in order to do that, we're gonna go and just go predicted and then print out class names of our predicted index. Like that. So this will go ahead and set up your CNN. All this code will set up your CNN, pre-process your images, flatten them into the proper formats. It'll also have graphs to show you guys what the model is looking at. And finally, the last step is just making a prediction. We created a function to go ahead and disable all of our evaluations, our changing of those weights, and just simply go and take an input and return an output. So that is what all this is doing. For the sake of time, though, we do have to go back to our slides, do our awesome announcements, and say goodbye. If you guys are still struggling, everything will be on the Google Classroom with explanations, with the slideshows, with everything, including a solutions notebook. So if you guys' code is getting errors, always just cross-check against the solutions notebook, and you will probably be able to immediately see the difference and understand what the error is. There's also a lot of good comments on these notebooks that we've made for you guys. So refer to that if you guys need help understanding. Of course, we're here to answer your guys' questions whenever you need them. But now let's go over some basic announcements.
Also, I know we are running a little bit over time, but I don't want to hold you guys back. So if you have to leave, that's totally fine. But before you guys do start leaving, we do wanted to take like a little bit of like a class group photo kind of thing. So if you guys feel comfortable, if you guys still like turn your cameras on, we could just like snap a screenshot really fast. We really appreciate that. It is our final class, so it's so nice to see all your guys' faces.
No worries, Ishan. It's only if you want to, only if you're comfortable with
Yeah,
it.
it's only if you guys want to.
I mean, did you take it?
Yeah.
Okay. We do have something really important. Anjali, everything should be on Google Classroom for all the classes. I'll double check if something isn't. We'll have a quick feedback survey to send out. This will also be posted on Classroom if you guys don't get to it. But we really want you guys to complete the survey because it helps us improve our teaching and also helps us kind of gain areas of where we need to improve. So do fill out that survey. Aveen will send it soon in the chat. The second thing before we let you guys go, I promise is the last thing. We have board applications out. So if you guys are interested in having a leadership role in this international organization, then please go ahead and fill out whatever for whatever role you want, fill out the application form. These roles are awesome and they really give you a chance to get volunteer service hours while also showing your leadership in your community. We have a couple roles. So first we have
I added a couple slides after this if you want to
Oh, you
like
did? Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Okay, cool. So here's board positions that you guys should apply for, okay? There's no harm in applying. Oh, thank you, Samaya. We'll check your application soon. So these are really good opportunities. We just want to go over some of them. We have our staff writers who are going to write and publish content for our journal. You guys get service hours for however many hours you guys put into your guys' writing, which is a really easy way to earn hours and also show your writing skills and your involvement in AI. Think about it. You're going to be caught up with all the latest news because you'll be publishing out articles on an international platform that we have. You can build your own portfolio and show your impact. Secondly, we have our marketing team, which is kind of our social media side. So if you guys are into that, we need people to create and promote content on our social media and kind of share their own knowledge on social media, maybe generate informational reels or anything you guys are comfortable with. You guys should apply for the marketing team even if you have the slightest inclination to. Like even if you don't want to do it just ever so slightly, go ahead and apply. There's no harm. There's in fact there's no harm and there's ultimate benefits. You guys get so many hours and you guys get so many elite opportunities as a result of these roles. Now, one of our biggest roles, so if you guys are looking for a founder position, if you guys are looking for a president position, we have this opportunity for you guys to found your very own YouthX AI chapter. So what this means, a chapter is kind of like a branch of a nonprofit. So this could be a club, it could be at your house, it could be at your library, it could be anything, but it's just a kind of a branch of YouthX AI, and you guys essentially become founders and presidents of those subgroups basically. You guys can assemble a team. You guys can make a major impact directly. You guys will be doing it. You can use all of our resources, like our slideshows. We'll train you guys on how to teach. We'll give you extra mentorship. Our slideshows, our projects, our resources. We'll have everything made just for you, and all you guys have to do is run it in your community. And the awesome part is like you're probably wondering why would I do that? Okay, thank you, Evelyn. You're probably wondering why would I do that? Well, the truth is it makes it a lot easier for you. You don't have to design any curriculum. All you have to do is learn and teach. And it also gives you guys a major volunteer service hour source while also giving you guys a really big leadership role. Like you're the founder and president of a nonprofit, essentially. So if you guys are looking to do that, go ahead and apply. There's a lot of benefits. There's more details on the forms if you guys are still curious. We do want to mention one thing. If you do apply for any of these founder roles, make sure you also fill out an application for being a staff writer, because we want everyone to show their commitment. And there's no like the staff writer role is super flexible. Like it's so flexible. Just sign up and you're able to post articles anytime, anywhere. There's no binding thing between us. It's
And you're
all
getting volunteer hours for it.
yeah, and you're getting volunteer hours for everything. So if you guys are in ever in need of some volunteer hours, just go ahead and write up a little article and publish it on our platform and we'll review it. But yeah, those are opportunities for you guys. Some big ones, again, founder and president of our chapter, and then staff writer, and then part of our international marketing team. Whatever you guys are into, go ahead and apply. There's no harm, doesn't cost anything. Everyone is welcome. Regardless of your skills, we're super excited to have everyone. And that concludes our last ever lesson. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we're so happy to have taught you guys.
Oh, we're gonna miss seeing you